Welcome back to Cowboy Story Station, where the frontier comes alive with tales of courage, heart, and the bonds that form when we need each other most. The winter wind howled across the prairie, rattling the windows of the old ranch house where Thomas Wade had lived alone for 3 years. His wife had been gone that long, taken by a fever one cruel autumn, leaving him with an empty house and a heart that refused to heal. He had learned to sleep lightly, the silence of his home a constant companion he had grown to accept. But on this bitter night, a sound broke through the wind, something different, something human. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more desperate, cutting through the darkness like a cry for help. Thomas sat up in bed, his hand instinctively reaching for the lantern beside him, his heart beginning to pound. No one came to his ranch at midnight. No one came at all, unless they needed something desperately. He struck a match, the tiny flame illuminating his weathered face, and lit the lantern with practiced hands. The knock came again, faster now, smaller hands pounding against the heavy wooden door. He pulled on his boots and crossed the cold floor, the lantern casting dancing shadows across the walls. When he opened the door, the winter wind rushed in, carrying with it a small figure barely visible in the darkness. A little girl stood on his porch, no more than 7 years old, her thin nightgown no match for the biting cold. Her face was pale, her lips blue, tears frozen on her cheeks, her small body shaking violently. But her eyes, wide and frightened, held his gaze with a desperation that stopped his heart. "Mama needs help," she whispered, her voice so small it was nearly swallowed by the wind. "Please, mister," she begged, her small hands reaching up toward him. "My mama is very sick." Thomas knelt down without thinking, bringing the lantern close to warm her tiny frozen face. "Where's your mama, child?" he asked, his voice rough from years of silence, but gentle now. She pointed into the darkness, toward the distant ridge where no neighbor lived for miles. Thomas looked where she pointed, then back at her trembling form, and made a decision in his heart. He scooped her up, wrapping her in his own coat, feeling how light she was, how fragile. "We need to get you warm first," he said, carrying her inside and setting her by the stove. He wrapped a blanket around her small shoulders and poured hot coffee into a tin cup, holding it to her hands. She clutched the cup, her fingers too small to wrap around it, her whole body still shaking. "What's your name?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her so his eyes met hers. "Sarah," she whispered, "and my mama is Mary, and she needs help right now." Thomas looked toward the window where darkness stretched endless, then back at this brave little girl. "How far is your home, Sarah?" he asked, and she pointed again toward the ridge. "A long way," she said, "but I ran, and I wasn't scared because Mama needed me." Thomas felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 long years. He stood and began moving, grabbing every lantern he owned, lighting them one by one. Sarah watched him from the chair, wrapped in the blanket, her eyes following his every movement. He pulled on his heavy coat, his gloves, his hat, then stopped and looked at her. "I need you to stay here where it's warm," he said, but her face crumpled with fear. "No, please," she cried. "I need to go back to Mama. I need to show you the way." Thomas looked at her small, determined face and saw something he recognized: courage. He lifted her again, wrapping her in the blanket and his coat, holding her against his chest. Together, they stepped out into the freezing night, every lantern on the ranch blazing behind them. His horse stood saddled and ready, and he mounted with Sarah held safe against him. The lantern light cut a path through the darkness, and the little girl pointed the way. They rode hard across the frozen ground, the wind biting at their faces, the cold stealing their breath. Sarah clung to him, her small body pressed against his chest, her directions never wavering. "There," she cried, pointing to a small cabin nestled in the trees, barely visible in the darkness. Thomas kicked his horse faster, the lantern swinging, his heart pounding with urgency. He dismounted with Sarah still in his arms and pushed open the cabin door. Inside, a woman lay on a simple bed, pale and still, her breathing shallow and labored. "Mama," Sarah cried, reaching out toward her mother, her voice breaking with fear. Thomas set Sarah down and moved to the woman's side, placing a hand on her forehead. She was burning with fever, her skin dry and hot, her eyes closed against the world. "Sarah," he said gently, "I need you to boil some water. Can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded, her face serious beyond her years, and moved to the small stove. Thomas worked through the night, cooling the woman's fever, giving her water, watching over both of them. Sarah brought him cloths, held her mother's hand, and never once complained or cried. As dawn broke through the cabin windows, the woman's fever finally broke, her breathing evening out. She opened her eyes slowly, confused at first, then saw her daughter sleeping beside her. Then she saw Thomas sitting in the corner, exhausted, his coat still wrapped around her child. "Who are you?" she whispered, and Thomas, for the first time in years, found himself smiling. "Just a neighbor," he said softly, who answered a midnight knock from a very brave little girl. The woman looked at her daughter, then back at him, tears forming in her weak but grateful eyes. Sarah stirred, waking to see her mother awake, and threw her small arms around her neck. Thomas stood to leave, but Sarah's hand caught his, her small fingers wrapping around his. "Don't go," she said simply, and he looked at her, then at her mother, who nodded slowly. He sat back down, and in that small cabin, as morning light filled the room, three lonely souls found each other. Sometimes the smallest knock opens the biggest door, and the family you find becomes the home you never knew you needed.